When it comes to bodybuilding, few names spark reactions as mixed as Lee Priest. To some, he's a misunderstood genius. To others, a walking controversy. But one thing no one can deny is the impact he had on the sport. Short in stature, but massive in presence, Lee became a figure who challenged every traditional standard of professional bodybuilding. Standing just over 5 feet 3 inches, about 1.60 meters, he built a physique capable of beating much larger athletes on stage. That's how he earned the nickname Giant Killer. In a sport where size is often seen as raw power, Lee proved again and again that muscle density, proportions, and visual impact could take down any so-called giant. And this wasn't a one-time thing. It became a pattern throughout his career. So without further delay, let's dive into the story of this true titan of bodybuilding. Lee Priest was born in Newcastle and grew up in Wallsend, Australia, in a simple environment that already hinted at something unusual. From a very young age, he seemed to have a natural relationship with physical strength. And this wasn't just kid stuff. Lee loved testing limits, lifting heavy objects, and pushing his own body, even if he couldn't fully explain why. As a child, he carried his sister around, pushed cars in the garage just to see if he could, and turned everyday chores into strength tests. What looked like harmless curiosity was actually an early sign of a mindset focused on physical challenge and self-overcoming. But his childhood was also shaped by deep emotional breaks. His parents' separation, after his father came out as gay, brought instability and confusion. In a far less tolerant era, that quickly became cruel ammunition at school. Lee became a constant target of bullying, jokes, and prejudice-filled taunts. That hostile environment helped shape his personality. To survive, Lee developed a defensive, sarcastic, and provocative attitude. His sharp humor became a shield. That class clown wasn't just the funny kid. It was someone trying to cope with pain, rejection, and daily humiliation. Amid all of this, one figure became essential: his grandfather, Owen. He was the one who introduced Lee to weight training and bodybuilding in a more structured way. More than just teaching exercises, his grandfather offered guidance, support, and a sense of belonging. At 12 years old, Lee stopped just messing around with weights and began training seriously. A year later, at 13, he stepped on stage for the first time. There were no expectations, no pressure, but there was something no one could ignore. Lee won, and that moment changed everything. What had seemed like a youthful curiosity suddenly became a one-way path. Still a teenager, Lee began competing against grown men. Instead of backing down, he stood out. His muscle density, early physical maturity, and commanding stage presence grabbed attention immediately. Every competition reinforced the same message. This kid was anything but ordinary, and he absolutely belonged there. Results started stacking up fast. State titles, back-to-back wins, and at just 17 years old, the Mr. Australia title. He would repeat the achievement at 18 and 19, something extremely rare for someone so young. In a sport where experience usually outweighs raw talent, Lee simply ignored the unwritten rules. Interestingly, none of this came from a clear childhood dream of becoming a professional bodybuilder. Lee didn't grow up obsessed with trophies or magazine covers. His inspirations came from somewhere else entirely. Characters like He-Man, the over-the-top look of comic book heroes, and the raw strength shown in movies like Rocky IV. Bodybuilding became a way to physically resemble what he admired. And it was on stage that everything finally clicked. There, Lee wasn't the kid getting mocked at school or the punchline of jokes. He was respected, judged solely by what he had built with his own body. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. Among the many unlikely stories in Lee Priest's career, few are as symbolic as the one involving his mother. During his early rise in bodybuilding, a situation unfolds that blends family support, awkwardness, and something completely unheard of in the sport. Lee's mother decides she wants to compete too, not alone, but alongside her son, in a pairs category. At first, the idea sounded absurd, even to Lee himself. He reacted with his usual sharp humor, almost as a defense mechanism. But his mother was serious. For months, she committed to training, changed her habits, transformed her physique, and proved this wasn't a passing whim. It was real dedication, effort, and discipline. When they finally stepped on stage together, the moment carried a strange mix of pride and teenage embarrassment. For Lee, Sharing the spotlight with his own mother was, at the very least, uncomfortable. But at the same time, there was something undeniably powerful about it. Two worlds colliding: family and bodybuilding, emotional support and physical discipline, all meeting under the stage lights. The outcome makes it all even more unforgettable. They win. Mother and son become the first duo of their kind to ever take a title, carving their place in history in a completely unexpected way. It wasn't just a competitive victory. It was a symbol of unity, resilience, and mutual trust. After everything he'd been through, Lee Priest reaches a breaking point. Tired of being held back by his age and ignored by rules that seemed to shift depending on who benefited from them, he makes a final decision. He's done waiting. After years competing naturally, Lee chooses the path many were already taking in silence. For him, there was no more room for naivety. The change is fast and impossible to miss. In just a few weeks, his physique evolves dramatically, proving that the talent had always been there. It had simply been held back by circumstance. But the most important step wasn't physical, it was geographical. Lee packs his bags and heads to the United States, thinking he'd stay for just a few weeks. What he didn't know was that this trip would reshape his life for nearly 2 decades. In the US, everything moves at lightning speed. At just 20 years old, Lee earns his pro card, becoming one of the youngest bodybuilders ever to do so. Contracts start rolling in, photo shoots, competition invites, and suddenly, the kid from Australia is right in the middle of the global bodybuilding scene. Even standing only about 5 feet 4 inches tall, roughly 1.62 meters, and weighing around 200 pounds on stage, about 91 kilos, Lee goes head-to-head with much bigger men without a hint of inferiority. Quite the opposite. His muscle density, proportions, and sheer visual impact made him look every bit as massive as any giant standing next to him. This marks the true transformation of Lee Priest, not just as a professional athlete, but as a global figure in the sport. Throughout the 1990s, Lee stops being seen as just a promising name and turns into a nightmare in side-by-side comparisons. Whenever he lined up next to much larger athletes, something strange happened. The giants started to look ordinary. Lee's muscle density, quality, and visual dominance made size alone stop being an advantage. The peak of this phenomenon comes in 1997. That season represents one of the strongest phases of Lee's career, with multiple competitions, moral victories, and standout placings. He repeatedly defeats athletes who outweighed him by dozens of pounds and stood several inches taller, show after show, cementing the nickname that would follow him forever, the Giant Killer. The Mr. Olympia that year perfectly captures that moment. In one of the strongest lineups in history, Lee finishes in the top 6, proving he wasn't there just to fill the lineup. For an athlete with his history of suspensions and conflicts, that result carried even more weight. It was a clear statement. He belonged among the elite. But Lee's impact went far beyond score sheets. He got inside his competitors' heads. There was something deeply unsettling about losing to someone labeled as small in a sport obsessed with size. It shook egos, confidence, and long-term plans. One of the most telling stories involves a young Ronnie Coleman. Years later, Ronnie himself admitted that losing to Lee during that period was so frustrating it nearly made him quit competitive bodybuilding altogether. Can you imagine that? The future 8-time Mr. Olympia rattled by a man so many people kept underestimating. As Lee's results on stage improved, his relationship with the Federation moved in the opposite direction. In an era when almost everyone chose silence, Lee chose to speak out, and loudly. He exposed what many already knew but pretended not to see: drug use, dosages, backstage deals, and political decisions that had very little to do with physical merit. That attitude quickly turned him into a problem. Fines started piling up, suspensions became routine, and clashes with officials turned into part of daily life. Lee wasn't being punished just for breaking rules, but for what he represented: someone impossible to control. In a system that worked best with obedience, he was the exact opposite. Lee began openly calling out how athletes were treated. In his view, many competitors were pushed into insane schedules, traveling non-stop with no real rest, locked into rigid contracts, and treated like disposable parts. He compared it to being cattle, dragged from show to show with no real voice or choice. Money was always the most sensitive issue. Lee openly questioned how much major events were making, and how little of that actually reached the athletes. Especially when it came to the Mr. Olympia, he criticized the fact that only a tiny elite walked away with prize money, while equally conditioned competitors went home empty-handed. Those words came at a cost. Every statement raised the tension between Lee and the Federation. But for him, staying silent would have cost even more. As time went on, in the early 2000s, Lee Priest's body finally demanded payment. Heart problems appeared suddenly and put his life at real risk. Doctors recommended stepping away completely from intense physical activity, something unthinkable for someone who had lived for training his entire life. For the first time, Lee's toughest opponent wasn't on stage. It was inside his own body. Even so, he came back to competition, not out of obsession with titles, but out of loyalty to his fans and commitments he had already made. Still, something had changed. His relationship with competitive bodybuilding was no longer the same. The fire that once burned purely to win was replaced by a colder, more pragmatic view of the sport. Lee began to admit something many athletes never say out loud. He never competed just for trophies. For him, bodybuilding was always bigger than final placings. A large part of his income came from contracts, appearances, travel, and, most importantly, his connection with the audience. The stage mattered, but it was never the whole picture. That realization completely shifted his priorities. The pressure to win faded, and the need to prove himself to judges disappeared. Lee started to see that judging didn't always reflect who truly brought the best physique or put in the hardest work. That awareness brought disappointment, but also freedom. A bit later, in 2002, Lee experiences one of the most defining moments of his entire career. At the San Francisco Pro, he steps on stage not just to compete, but to make a statement. Days before the show, he had confronted officials directly, questioning decisions, politics, and the way athletes were treated. In almost any other situation, that would have been a guaranteed recipe for disaster. But against all expectations, Lee wins. That wasn't just his first major professional victory, it was a message. He proved that even as a problem for the system, his physique was impossible to ignore. This wasn't submission. It wasn't political maneuvering. It was resistance. It was winning despite the environment, not because of it. That victory, however, didn't bring peace. Quite the opposite. His conflicts with the Federation intensified even more. Lee kept saying exactly what he thought, now with even less fear. To him, if the price of honesty was already being charged, there was no reason to back down. The final breaking point came when Lee started voicing his criticisms on radio shows. There, his words reached an even wider audience, and the discomfort within the Federation became unbearable. What had once been fines and temporary suspensions escalated into increasingly severe punishments. Until the final decision was made, Lee Priest was banned for life from the IFBB. No stage, no events, not even the right to attend as a guest. For many, that would have been the end of the road. Away from the stage, Lee proved that his identity had never been tied to a single sport. With the same intensity he brought to bodybuilding, he threw himself into a new world, motorsports. The pursuit of speed and adrenaline felt like a natural extension of his competitive personality. Once again, it wasn't casual curiosity, it was full commitment. Lee began racing seriously, competing in different categories, and quickly turned heads. It didn't take long for him to earn major wins and be recognized as Rookie of the Year, proving that his ability to adapt was no accident. The track became a new stage, one where the risk was real and control had to be absolute. In motorsports, Lee finds something familiar: competition without filters, without subjective judgment. You either win or you don't. There's no room for politics disguised as aesthetics. That kind of objectivity appealed to someone who had always struggled with backstage games and questionable decisions. It was a more straightforward environment, just like him. At the same time, his image keeps circulating in the media. Lee appears on podcasts, TV shows, and promotional projects, staying in constant contact with fans around the world. Even outside the official bodybuilding circuit, his name never fades away. If anything, it becomes even more cult-like. One of the most curious moments of this phase happens in cinema. Lee takes part in motion capture work for the Hulk, lending his physical structure and movements to help bring the Green Giant to life. In that moment, His image officially goes beyond the limits of bodybuilding. As the years go by, Lee Priest's blunt, no-filter attitude starts to demand a higher price. Sponsors pull away, contracts are abruptly cut, and doors that were once wide open quietly begin to close. In a world where image and convenience often matter as much as performance, Lee becomes someone too difficult to be associated with. The isolation doesn't come only from institutions, but from other athletes as well. Many choose to keep their distance to avoid being linked to someone labeled as a troublemaker. Lee realizes that behind the scenes, support almost always depends on convenience. When you speak too much, there's very little room left for comfortable alliances. It's in this context that certain rivalries gain momentum, especially the one with Sean Ray. What starts as professional disagreement quickly turns personal. Public jabs, accusations, and provocations become part of the offstage spectacle. For the audience, it was entertainment. For Lee, it was the direct consequence of never backing down. Even so, he always insists on one thing. He never spoke out to promote himself or gain an advantage. According to Lee, his motivation was different. He believed someone had to say what was wrong, especially in defense of athletes who trained just as hard as the champions but went home without recognition or money. That choice puts him in a thankless position. Telling the truth rarely brings immediate rewards. More often than not, it brings the exact opposite. But Lee accepts that cost knowingly. To him, silence would have been a greater betrayal than any lost contract. Still, life had more difficult chapters ahead. The death of his grandfather Owen marks a quiet but definitive turning point in Lee Priest's life. More than a relative, Owen was his emotional foundation, his mentor, and the figure who had been there since the very first weights were lifted. Without him, bodybuilding no longer made sense in the same way. Lee tries, at times, to seriously consider a consistent return to the professional circuit. But something is always missing. The motivation no longer comes from within, and competing without passion was never who he was. Little by little, he accepts that the cycle had ended, not because of defeat, but because of emotional exhaustion. Even so, the story still had one final special chapter waiting. In 2013, Lee decides to return to the stage to compete at the NABBA Mr. Universe. This time, there's no pressure, no career ambitions, and no financial interests involved. It's a comeback driven purely by heart, a gift to the fans, to friends, and to the family that had always stood by him. That victory didn't carry the weight of just another title. It was symbolic, a true closing of the circle. Once again, Lee proved he was still capable, but more importantly, that he could choose when and why to compete. Looking back at Lee Priest's entire journey, it becomes clear that he never saw himself as an untouchable star. For him, it was never about status, idolization, or posing as a perfect role model. Lee always defined himself in much simpler terms. Someone who trains hard, lives by what he believes, and tells the truth, no matter the cost. That attitude naturally divides opinions. Some admire him deeply, while others never manage to accept him. But maybe that's exactly the point. Lee never tried to be universally liked. In a sport where many learn to please others just to survive, he chose to stay true to himself, even when that meant losing space, money, and opportunities. The legacy he leaves isn't found only in trophies or final placings on big stages. It lives in the image of an athlete who faced both physical and institutional giants, who beat bigger men on stage and even bigger systems off it, who refused to bow his head, even knowing the consequences. Lee Priest became a symbol of resistance in an environment marked by silence, quiet deals, and heavy politics. His story exposes the less glamorous side of bodybuilding, but also proves that it's possible to walk through that world without losing your identity. In the end, the real question isn't how many titles he won, but what kind of mark he left behind. And maybe that's the greatest victory of all, because when the lights go out and the trophies are put away, what truly remains is the courage to be exactly who you are. And in that, Lee Priest was unbeatable.